30 years ago, his name had been inked in bold across the front page of the Willow Creek Gazette. Local hero saves two under fire. The photograph showed a younger Walter, square-jawed and steely-eyed, his dress blues crisp as he stood on a makeshift stage at the town's Memorial Day parade. He'd been 23, barely back from Vietnam, his chest heavy with a Bronze Star for dragging two wounded Marines to safety under a hail of mortar fire. The town had cheered. Children tugged at his sleeves for pictures. The mayor, sweat beading on his brow, had handed Walter the key to a small apartment on Maple Street, a gesture of gratitude that felt like a promise. "You're one of us," it said. "We'll never forget." But promises fade faster than newsprint. The apartment was long gone, lost to a bad loan when medical bills piled up after surgery in '98. The parade photos were stuffed in a box somewhere, or maybe burned. Walter couldn't remember. His buddies from the war were either dead or scattered, their letters unanswered, their voices reduced to echoes in his dreams. The world had moved on, and Walter's name, once a beacon, had become inconvenient. In the '90s, the town's new leadership didn't want reminders of a war they'd rather forget. The Gazette archives were misplaced during a library renovation. The honor board in the town square, where Walter's name had once gleamed, was replaced with a digital billboard advertising car insurance. Now, at 75, Walter lived in a single room at the Willow Creek Home for Veterans, a squat brick building that smelled of bleach and regret. His dress blues hung in a closet, untouched, the gold buttons dull with dust. The only thing he carried from those days was the photograph, a grainy black and white of him and his squad, grinning in the jungle, their faces young and unscarred, and the Bronze Star, which he kept pinned to the wall above his bed. It was his anchor, proof that he'd once been more than a shadow on a bench. Every morning, Walter walked the half-mile to the park, his steps slow but deliberate, his cane tapping the pavement like a metronome. He'd sit, sip his tea, and watch the world unfold. Joggers in bright spandex, mothers pushing strollers, kids chasing soccer balls. He didn't expect anyone to notice him. He didn't want their pity. But sometimes, when the wind carried the faint notes of the national anthem from a nearby school, his shoulders would straighten and his fingers would trace the edges of the photograph, as if he could step back into that moment when he was whole. It was a Tuesday when the boy appeared. The park was quieter than usual, the morning air sharp with the promise of frost. Walter was halfway through his thermos, the tea gone cold, when he heard the crunch of gravel. A kid, no older than 8, stood a few feet away, his sneakers scuffed and his hoodie too big for his skinny frame. His dark eyes were wide, curious, fixed on Walter like he was a puzzle to solve. "You a soldier?" the boy asked, his voice cutting through the silence. Walter blinked, caught off guard. He hadn't been asked that in years. His first instinct was to wave the kid off, to sink back into his solitude. But something in the boy's gaze, earnest, unguarded, held him. Walter's eyes flicked to the tattoo peeking from his collar, then back to the kid. He said finally, his voice rough, like gravel underfoot. "A long time ago." The boy stepped closer, undeterred. "My grandpa says soldiers have medals. You got any?" Walter's hand tightened around the thermos. He could have lied, could have said no, and sent the kid running. But the boy's question wasn't just curiosity. It was a spark, a tiny flare in the fog of Walter's days. He reached into his pocket, where he sometimes carried the Bronze Star, not to show it off, but to feel its weight, a reminder that he'd done something worth remembering. He pulled it out, the ribbon faded, but the star still gleaming faintly in the morning light. The boy's eyes widened, his mouth forming a small O. "Is that real?" Walter nodded, his throat tight. "Real as it gets." The boy reached out, then stopped, his hand hovering. "Can I?" Walter hesitated. The metal was more than metal. It was the screams of that night in '69, the weight of his buddy's blood on his hands, the endless march through the mud to safety. But the boy's face, so open and unguarded, reminded him of the kids at the parade all those years ago. He pressed the metal into the boy's palm. "Barry," he said, his voice softer now. "Take it. But remember, it weighs more than it seems." The boy's fingers closed around the metal, his grin bright as the sun breaking through clouds. "Thanks, mister," he called, already sprinting back to a woman waiting near the gazebo, her arms crossed against the chill. Walter watched them go, the boy waving the medal like a trophy, the mother glancing back with a puzzled frown. He waited for the usual pang of regret, but it didn't come. Instead, there was a quiet warmth, like the first sip of tea on a cold morning. He didn't know the boy's name, didn't need to. For the first time in years, someone had seen him. Not the old man on the bench, but Walter Ellis, the Marine who'd carried his brothers to safety. The next morning, Walter didn't go to the park. He woke with a heaviness in his chest, not from illness, but from a sense that something had shifted. The medal was gone, given away on a whim, and with it, a piece of his armor. He sat on the edge of his bed, staring at the empty spot on the wall where the bronze star had hung. The room felt smaller, the air thicker with the ghosts of his past. He thought of the boy's grin, the way it had lit up the park, and wondered if he'd done something foolish or something right. Instead of his usual walk, Walter stayed in, sorting through the box under his bed. It was a battered thing, held together with duct tape, filled with relics he rarely touched. Letters from his squad, a faded American flag, a newspaper clipping from the Gazette with the headline, "Our Hero." The photograph was there too, the one he carried to the park, but seeing it now in the dim light of his room felt different. The young men in the picture were strangers, their smiles frozen in a moment that no longer existed. He traced their faces, lingering on the two he'd saved, Bobby and Ray, their names as sharp in his mind as the day he'd lost them to time. The day passed in a blur of routine. A lukewarm breakfast in the home's dining hall, the drone of a TV nobody watched, the shuffle of other residents moving through their own quiet lives. Walter kept to himself, as always, but his thoughts kept drifting to the park, to the boy, to the medal now in a child's hands. He wondered if the kid would lose it, or if he'd keep it safe, maybe show it off to his friends. The thought made Walter smile, a rare thing that felt foreign on his face. By evening, he'd made up his mind. He'd go back to the park tomorrow, not for the boy, not for the medal, but because it was his place, his ritual. He needed it as much as the park needed its flag or its pond. He fell asleep with the photograph on his nightstand, the clipping tucked beside it, the words, "Our Hero," barely legible in the fading ink. When Walter arrived at the park the next morning, the bench was different. A single red carnation lay across it, its petals vibrant against the weathered wood. Beside it was a folded piece of paper, yellowed and brittle, but unmistakable. It was the Gazette clipping, the one he'd kept in his box, though he hadn't brought it to the park in years. He picked it up, his hands trembling, not from age, but from the weight of memory. The headline stared back at him, "Our Hero." He looked around, half expecting to see the boy or his mother, but the park was empty, the flagpole casting a long shadow in the dawn light. The carnation smelled faintly sweet, like the flowers at the Memorial Day parade all those years ago. Walter sat, the clipping in one hand, the flower in the other, and felt something shift inside him. It wasn't pride or vindication, but something quieter, deeper, a sense that he wasn't as forgotten as he'd thought. He didn't know who'd left the carnation or how they'd found the clipping. Maybe the boy's mother had dug through old records, or maybe someone else in Willow Creek had remembered. It didn't matter. For the first time in decades, Walter felt seen. This is just the beginning of Walter's story, a tale of quiet heroism and the power of small acts to restore dignity. In the next part, we'll uncover who left the carnation, how Walter's past comes to light, and the ripple effect his moment of recognition has on Willow Creek. For more stories of gratitude and grace, subscribe to Hoffman's Stories and join us in honoring the unsung heroes in our communities. The red carnation lay on Walter Ellis's nightstand now, its petals curling slightly at the edges, but still vivid against the gray of his room at the Willow Creek Home for Veterans. Beside it was the Gazette clipping, the headline, "Our Hero," staring up at him like a ghost from 1969. Walter hadn't returned to the park since finding them on his bench 2 days ago. The weight of that moment, Someone, somewhere, remembering him, kept him tethered to his room, sorting through memories he'd long buried. The photograph of his squad, the one he'd carried to the park for years, sat propped against the wall, its faces clearer in his mind than ever. Bobby's crooked grin, Ray's quiet eyes, the jungle heat, the mortar blasts, the endless march to safety. It was all there, sharp as a blade. Outside, Willow Creek hummed with its usual rhythm, the clatter of dishes at the diner, the drone of traffic on Main Street, the laughter of kids spilling out of the school. But inside Walter's room, time felt suspended, as if the carnation and the clipping had cracked open a door to the past. He didn't know who'd left them, but the gesture gnawed at him, not with suspicion, but with a quiet ache. For 30 years, he'd been invisible, a shadow on a bench. Now, someone had seen him. The question was why? The answer came on a chilly Thursday morning, when a knock rattled the door of Walter's room. He opened it to find Mrs. Hargrove, the home's director, her glasses perched low on her nose. She held an envelope, its edges crisp and official-looking, with Willow Creek Veterans Association stamped in the corner. "Walter," she said, her voice softer than her usual brisk tone, "this came for you. They're asking you to come to the community center tomorrow. Some kind of event." Walter took the envelope, his fingers brushing the embossed seal. "What kind of event?" Mrs. Hargrove shrugged, but her eyes lingered on him, curious. "Didn't say much. Just that it's important and they want you there. Dress nice if you can." He nodded, closing the door as she shuffled off. The envelope felt heavier than it should, like it carried more than paper. He slid it open with a pocket knife, pulling out a single sheet. The letter was brief, typed in formal font, inviting him to a special recognition ceremony at the community center. No details, no explanation, just a time, 10 a.m., and a request to bring any personal artifacts of service. At the bottom, a handwritten note in blue ink. "We haven't forgotten." Walter's chest tightened. He sat on the edge of his bed, the letter trembling in his hands. Recognition? After all these years? It felt like a trick, or maybe a mistake. He hadn't been to a veterans event in decades, not since the town stopped inviting him to parades. His name wasn't on any lists anymore. Yet here was this letter, pulling him back into a world he'd thought had closed its doors. He glanced at the closet where his dress blues hung, untouched since the 80s. The thought of wearing them again made his stomach churn. They wouldn't fit, not with the years and the scars and the weight of time. But the letter's words, "we haven't forgotten," stuck with him, like the boy's question in the park. "You, a soldier?" He thought of the carnation, the clipping, the metal now in a child's hands. Maybe this wasn't a mistake. Maybe it was a chance. The Willow Creek Community Center was a low, brick building with a sagging roof and a parking lot cracked by weeds. On Friday morning, it buzzed with more life than Walter had seen in years. Cars lined the street, American flags fluttered from lampposts, and a small crowd milled outside, their voices carrying on the crisp air. The scent of coffee and fresh-baked donuts wafted from a table near the entrance, where volunteers in red vests handed out cups. A banner stretched above the door, "Honoring our veterans." Walter paused at the edge of the lot, his cane planted firmly, his breath fogging in the cold. He wore a clean flannel shirt and his old army jacket, the best he could manage. In his pocket was the photograph, and under his arm, a small box with the Gazette clipping and a folded letter from Bobby, written days before he died in '71. Inside, the center was warm and noisy, the gym transformed with rows of folding chairs and a makeshift stage. A projector screen displayed a slideshow of old photos. Soldiers in Korea, Vietnam, Desert Storm. Walter scanned the crowd. Gray-haired men in VFW caps, younger veterans in camouflage jackets, families with kids clutching tiny flags. He felt out of place, like a ghost wandering into someone else's story. He found a seat in the back, hoping to slip through unnoticed. The ceremony began with a color guard, high school cadets marching in with flags. The crowd stood for the Pledge of Allegiance, hands over hearts, and Walter's voice joined theirs, low but steady. A local pastor offered a prayer, followed by the mayor, new since Walter's time, giving a speech about sacrifice and service. Walter's eyes drifted to the slideshow, catching a grainy image of a Marine in dress blues. His breath caught. It was him. From the 1969 parade, the Gazette photo he'd thought was lost forever. Before he could process it, a voice cut through the room. "Ladies and gentlemen," said a man at the podium, tall and silver-haired, his voice carrying the clipped precision of a military officer. "I'm Colonel James Tanner, retired, and today we're here to right a wrong." The room quieted, heads turning. Walter's hands tightened on his cane. 30 years ago, Tanner continued, this town honored a Marine who risked everything to save his brothers. His name was Walter Ellis. He was our hero. But time has a way of dimming memories, and we let his story fade. Today, we're bringing it back. Walter froze, his pulse hammering. Heads turned, searching the room, but he shrank into his seat, his face burning. How did they know? Who had done this? The colonel's eyes found him, sharp and unwavering, and he gestured toward the stage. "Mr. Ellis, would you join us, please?" The crowd murmured, then began to clap, the sound swelling like a wave. Walter's legs felt leaden, but he stood, his cane tapping as he made his way forward. The applause grew, and he felt every eye on him, not with pity, but with something he hadn't felt in decades: respect. He climbed the stage, his back straight despite the ache in his knees, and faced the crowd. Colonel Tanner saluted him, crisp and deliberate, and Walter returned it, his hand trembling but sure. The colonel turned to the audience. In 1969, Corporal Walter Ellis, under heavy mortar fire in Vietnam, carried 2 wounded Marines to safety. He was the only one of his squad to survive that night. For his actions, he received the Bronze Star. But his sacrifice didn't end there. He came home to a town that promised to remember, then let him slip away. We're here to say, we see you, Walter. We remember. The crowd stood, their applause thundering. Walter's throat burned, his eyes stinging. He scanned the faces, searching for something: anger, indifference, anything to anchor him. Instead, he saw pride, tears, hands raised in salute. At the edge of the stage, he noticed a boy in a too-big hoodie, clutching a familiar medal. It was the kid from the park, standing with a woman who must have been his mother, her eyes wet but smiling. Beside them was an older man in a VFW cap, his face weathered but kind. Walter didn't know him, but the man nodded, as if sharing a secret. Colonel Tanner handed Walter a plaque, engraved with his name and the words, "Hero of Willow Creek." "This is long overdue," he said, his voice low enough for only Walter to hear. "And it's not all." The slideshow shifted, and a new image appeared. The Gazette clipping, blown up large, the headline bold. Below it, a photograph Walter hadn't seen in years. A candid shot of him and Bobby, laughing in the jungle, their rifles slung over their shoulders. The crowd gasped softly, and Walter's hand went to his pocket, where the same photo rested. How had they found it? The colonel leaned in. "A young man brought this to us. Said he found it with a medal you gave him. His mother tracked down the rest." Walter's eyes flicked to the boy, who grinned, waving the Bronze Star like a flag. The mother mouthed, "Thank you," and the older man, maybe her father, maybe a veteran himself, saluted. Walter nodded back, his chest tight with something he couldn't name. The ceremony ended with a reception, coffee and donuts, replaced by sandwiches and lemonade. People approached Walter, shaking his hand, sharing stories of their own service or their father's wars. He listened, his voice quiet but steady, the plaque heavy in his hands. The boy, whose name was Ethan, he learned, tugged at his sleeve. "I kept your medal safe," Ethan said, holding it out, "but Mom says it's yours." Walter knelt, ignoring the protest in his knees. "You hold on to it a bit longer, son. Just keep it safe." Ethan's grin returned, and he saluted, sloppy but sincere. Walter chuckled, the sound rusty but real. Later, Colonel Tanner pulled him aside. "We're starting a permanent exhibit at the library," he said. "Your story, others like it. We want your photo, your clippings, anything you're willing to share. This town won't forget again." Walter nodded, his gaze drifting to the crowd. He saw Mrs. Hargrove chatting with the mayor, Ethan's mother showing the old veteran a scrapbook, kids running with flags. The community center felt less like a building and more like a hearth, warm with shared purpose. He thought of the carnation, the clipping, the bench in the park. He didn't know who had left them. Maybe Ethan's mother, maybe the old veteran who'd saluted. But he knew what they meant. A spark. A reminder that even shadows can be seen. "I'll bring some things," Walter said finally, his voice steady. "For the exhibit." Tanner clapped his shoulder. "Good man." That night, Walter returned to his room, the plaque on his nightstand beside the carnation, which was now fully wilted but still bright. He opened his box, pulling out the letter from Bobby, the flag, the clippings. He'd share them not for the glory, but to keep his squad's memory alive. He thought of Ethan, the boy with his medal, and the colonel's words, "We see you." For the first time in decades, Walter felt the weight of his past lighten, not gone, but shared. The next morning, he walked to the park, his cane tapping a steady rhythm. He sat on his bench, the air cool and the flagpole snapping in the breeze. He didn't bring the thermos, didn't need it. Instead, he brought the plaque, its simple words, "Hero." A jogger passed, nodded, and Walter nodded back. A mother with a stroller smiled, and he tipped his chin. They were small acts, but they carried weight like a medal, like a memory, like a carnation left on a bench. Willow Creek changed after that day. The library exhibit opened a month later, Walter's story at its center, alongside photos and letters from other veterans. Ethan visited often, the Bronze Star pinned to his backpack, his questions endless but welcome. The community center started a monthly veterans breakfast, and the mayor promised a new bench in the park, engraved with Walter's name. Small acts, a nod, a salute, a story shared, rippled outward, reminding the town to see its own. Walter's story is a call to notice the quiet heroes among us. Us, the ones who carry their sacrifices silently. Who are they in your community? A veteran? A faded tattoo, barely visible? A neighbor with a story untold? Take a moment to ask, to listen, to honor. For more tales of gratitude and grace, subscribe to Hoffman's Stories and join us in celebrating the unsung.